In 1874, the United States Army realized something about the Comanche that changed their entire military strategy. They could not beat them in battle. The Comanche had held the southern plains for over 150 years, fought off the Spanish, the Mexicans, the Texans, and the Apache before any of them. Their warriors operated in terrain that killed unprepared soldiers in days, so the army stopped trying to outfight them. Instead, on a cold September morning, Colonel Ranald Mackenzie sent his 4th Cavalry into Palo Duro Canyon in the Texas Panhandle, and his soldiers burned over 200 tipis, destroyed massive stores of dried meat and buffalo hides, and captured more than 1,400 horses. They slaughtered over 1,000 of those horses on the spot. The goal was not to kill the Comanche. The goal was to kill their winter. And it worked. Because what Mackenzie understood, even if he never would have phrased it this way, is that the Comanche had built one of the most sophisticated cold-weather survival systems on the continent. Take that away, and the people who had never been conquered by any army on Earth were suddenly helpless against the one enemy that had never beaten them either, a plains winter without preparation. This is a story about what the Comanche knew about surviving cold, how that knowledge operated as a complete system, and why nearly all of it has been forgotten. The Comanche called themselves Numunuu, which translates simply to the people. They did not originate on the southern plains. Centuries before they became the dominant military force in the region, their ancestors were part of the broader Shoshone world in the Great Basin of present-day Wyoming. They were pedestrian hunters, following game on foot through mountain valleys and high desert, living in small family bands with limited territory and limited reach. Then they encountered the horse. Spanish colonists had brought horses to the American Southwest, and by the late 1600s, the Comanche had begun acquiring them through trade and raiding. The effect was immediate and total. Horses turned a scattered group of foot hunters into the most mobile, fighting, and hunting force the plains had ever seen. Within decades, the Comanche pushed south out of Wyoming and into the southern Great Plains, driving the Apache out of territory those tribes had held for generations. By the mid-1700s, the Comanche controlled a region that historians estimate at between 240,000 and 250,000 square miles. That territory, called Comancheria, stretched from the Arkansas River in present-day southern Colorado all the way down to the Edwards Plateau and the Rio Grande in central and south Texas. It extended east into western Oklahoma and west toward the Pecos River and the Sangre de Cristo Mountains of New Mexico. For context, that is larger than France, larger than Spain. A single indigenous nation, with no cities, no written language, and no centralized government, held and defended more land than most European empires could manage with standing armies and stone fortifications. And they did it through every winter the southern plains could throw at them. Now, when most people picture the southern plains, they think of heat, Texas in July, dry wind, sun-baked grass stretching to the horizon, and that is half the picture. The other half is what happens from November through March, when blue northers sweep down from Canada with almost no geographic barrier to slow them. Temperatures on the Llano Estacado, the Staked Plains, can drop below 0 Fahrenheit. Blizzards bury the prairie under feet of snow. Wind chill on the open grasslands makes exposed skin dangerous within minutes. The southern plains winter is not a mild inconvenience. It is genuinely lethal for anyone caught unprepared. The Comanche were never caught unprepared. And the reason is that their entire way of life was organized around the reality that winter was coming every year, and that surviving it required planning that began months before the first frost. Start with where they chose to spend the winter. The Comanche were nomadic, moving their camps constantly to follow bison herds and to keep their massive horse herds fed on fresh grass. But their movement was not random. It followed patterns refined over generations, and when winter approached, those patterns brought them to very specific kinds of places. River valleys, canyon floors, the sheltered draws and timbered bottomlands where cottonwood, elm, and hackberry trees provided windbreaks and firewood, and where the canyon walls themselves blocked the worst of the northern wind. Palo Duro Canyon, the place where their winter system was eventually destroyed, was itself one of their most important winter camps. The canyon runs roughly 120 miles long and averages 6 miles wide, cut 1,000 feet below the surface of the surrounding plains. Down on the canyon floor, the temperature could be 20 or 30 degrees warmer than on the exposed tableland above. The wind barely reached. Water ran through the Prairie Dogtown fork of the Red River. Timber grew along the banks. The Comanche camped there because the canyon did half the work of winter survival before they even unpacked. If you're finding this interesting, subscribe. We cover history like this every week. The shelter they unpacked was the Tipi, and describing it as a tent sells it short by a wide margin. The Comanche used a 4-pole foundation system, distinguishing their construction from the 3-pole designs used by tribes like the Sioux and Cheyenne. Each teepee required 15 to 25 poles, typically lodgepole pine or red cedar, each one 20 to 30 feet long. These poles were lashed together and spread in a cone that could withstand the prairie winds that flattened less engineered structures. Over that frame, the Comanche stretched tanned buffalo hides, typically 14 of them for an average-sized lodge. Buffalo hide is naturally insulating, breathable, and water-resistant. It stopped wind, it shed rain and snow, and it did something that no modern tent fabric can do as effectively without synthetic technology. It allowed the people inside to build a fire. That fire was the other half of the teepee's genius. At the top of the cone, the Comanche built adjustable smoke flaps, controlled by exterior poles that the firekeeper could raise, lower, or angle depending on wind direction. These flaps let smoke escape while keeping heat inside and rain out. Combined with the teepee's conical shape, which naturally directs warm air upward while trapping a warm pocket at human level, the system was remarkably efficient. But the real insulation came from the teepee liner. Originally made from tanned bison hide and later from canvas, the liner was secured to the inside of the tippy poles a few inches from the outer wall. This created a double wall system with a dead air gap between the layers, the same insulation principle that modern double-pane windows use. The liner also created an updraft that pulled smoke from the central fire up and out through the smoke flaps more efficiently, keeping the interior cleaner and warmer. Some of these liners were painted with scenes of battles, hunts, and spiritual visions, turning the interior wall into something between an art gallery and a family history. The floor was packed earth, sometimes covered with hides or wood chips for insulation from ground cold. The fire pit sat at the center, and the family slept in a radial arrangement around it, sharing body heat under layered buffalo robes with the fur side turned inward. An average teepee was heavy. The poles alone weighed around 400 pounds, and the hide cover added another 100 to 150 pounds on top of that. This was not a flimsy camping setup. This was a portable building, engineered to be dismantled and moved by horse-drawn travois in under an hour, then reassembled at the next camp just as fast. On the coldest nights, with the flaps adjusted and the fire burning steady, the inside of a Comanche teepee could be genuinely comfortable while the temperature outside was well below freezing. Compare that to what happens when a modern suburban home loses power in a winter storm. No heat, no insulation strategy, no backup plan. People wrap themselves in blankets and wait for the grid to come back on. The Comanche would have found that confusing, not because they were tougher than modern people, but because they had designed their shelter around the assumption that cold was constant, not the assumption that warmth was guaranteed. What they wore worked the same way. Comanche clothing was built from the same animals that provided their shelter, the buffalo and the deer. Men wore buckskin breechcloths, leggings, and shirts during warmer months. Women wore fringed buckskin skirts and poncho-style blouses. Children under the age of 8 or 9 often wore nothing at all in warm weather. Winter changed the wardrobe completely. Fur-lined buffalo robes were added as an outer layer. Leggings were doubled. Knee-length buffalo hide boots replaced standard moccasins, and those moccasins themselves were worth noting. Comanche moccasins used soles cut from the toughest section of the buffalo hide, a material hard enough to protect the foot from rocks and thorns but flexible enough for the kind of riding and running that Comanche life demanded. The key principle was layering. Not the synthetic fabric, moisture-wicking layering system that modern outdoor companies sell, but the original version that the outdoor industry eventually copied. An inner layer of soft, body-conforming buckskin against the skin, an insulating middle layer of thicker hide, and an outer windproof shell of buffalo fur. The natural properties of animal hides provided something that early European wool and cotton could not match in combination. Insulation, breathability, and water resistance, all in the same garment. You could sweat in a buffalo robe during hard riding and not end up hypothermic an hour later when you stopped, because the hide breathed and the fur dried fast. European soldiers and settlers who encountered the Comanche in winter often remarked on how lightly dressed they seemed relative to the conditions. Early Spanish colonial reports described Comanche riders operating in freezing weather wearing buffalo robes that looked crude by European tailoring standards but clearly kept them warm enough to fight, hunt, and travel for hours. What the Spanish did not understand was that the crudeness was the point. Tight, tailored clothing restricts blood circulation and traps sweat against the skin, both of which accelerate heat loss. Loose hides draped over the body created pockets of warm, still air, the same principle that makes a puffy down jacket work, except the Comanche figured it out centuries before anyone put goose feathers inside nylon. And now we get to what may be the single most important piece of the Comanche cold weather system, and the one that modern people understand least: calories. Cold is an energy problem. Your body burns calories to maintain its core temperature, and in extreme cold, it burns them fast. A person working outdoors in sub-zero conditions can need 4,000 to 5,000 calories a day just to maintain body weight. Fail to eat enough, and your body starts cannibalizing muscle for fuel. Your thinking slows, your coordination drops, hypothermia stops being a risk and starts being an inevitability. The Comanche answer to this problem was fat. Specifically, animal fat from bison, combined with dried bison meat, in a preparation called pemmican. The word comes from the Cree language, Pemmican, meaning fat made, though versions of the food existed across plains tribes, including the Comanche. The process was straightforward but precise. Lean bison meat was cut into thin strips and dried until it was brittle enough to shatter. Then it was pounded into a coarse powder using stone tools. Separately, bison fat, the hard suet from around the kidneys and other organs, was rendered by heating it slowly until it liquefied into tallow. The powdered meat and the hot tallow were mixed together at roughly a 1-to-1 ratio, sometimes with the addition of dried berries like choke cherries, which added flavor and vitamin C. The mixture was packed into rawhide containers called parfleche and left to solidify. The result was one of the most calorie-dense foods ever created from natural ingredients. Pemmican packed roughly 3,000 to 3,500 calories per pound. A single pound was enough to sustain a grown adult through a full day of hard physical activity in freezing conditions. It did not spoil. Stored properly in rawhide, pemmican lasted for years. Some historical accounts claim it remained edible for decades. The fat sealed out moisture and oxygen, and the dried meat was hostile to bacteria. It needed no refrigeration, no cooking, and no preparation. You cut a slice and ate it. Compare that to modern emergency food. Granola bars, about 400 calories per bar. Canned soup, maybe 300 calories per can. Even military MREs top out around 1,200 to 1,300 calories per meal. Pemmican made all of them look inefficient, and it was invented by people who had never heard of a calorie. The reason pemmican worked so well as a winter food goes beyond the raw numbers. Fat is metabolized differently than carbohydrates. Carbs give you a quick spike of energy followed by a crash. Fat burns slowly, providing sustained energy over hours. In a survival situation where you might go long periods between meals, that slow burn is the difference between functional and finished. The Comanche ate pemmican between hunts, on the move between camps, and during storms when leaving the teepee was dangerous or impossible. It was not an emergency food. It was the foundation of their winter diet, supplemented with whatever fresh game they could take. And the logistics of pemmican production were staggering. During the Great Fall buffalo hunts, women processed hundreds of pounds of meat and fat, drying and rendering in quantities that would sustain entire bands through months of winter. This was not casual food preparation. It was industrial-scale caloric engineering performed with stone tools and open fires, and it worked well enough that when European fur traders encountered pemmican for the first time, they immediately adopted it. The Hudson's Bay Company eventually ran a commercial pemmican trade that helped fuel the exploration and settlement of the Canadian frontier. Native tribes had also figured out something about vitamin C that European sailors would not solve for centuries. Scurvy killed thousands of European and colonial explorers and military men operating in cold climates. The Comanche and other plains tribes added choke cherries and other wild berries to their pemmican, which are rich in vitamin C. They did not know the chemistry. They knew that people who ate the berries through winter stayed healthier than people who did not, and that was enough. Traditional knowledge does not always explain why something works. It just works, because it has been tested across more generations than any clinical trial could run. The Comanche understood something about cold that modern nutritional science is only now catching up to. In extreme environments, food is fuel, and the most important quality of fuel is energy density per unit of weight. Everything else, taste, variety, presentation, is a luxury that cold does not care about. But the system only worked if all of its parts were in place. Shelter without food fails. Food without shelter fails, and both of them fail without the one element that tied the entire Comanche cold weather system together: the horse. By the early 1800s, Comanche communities, called rancherias, typically consisted of roughly 250 people supported by herds of approximately 1,000 horses and mules. Those horses were not pets. They were infrastructure. They carried the tipi poles, the buffalo hides, the parfleche containers full of pemmican, the robes, the tools, and the people themselves from camp to camp as the seasons shifted. When winter closed in and snow covered the grass, the horses did something remarkable. They ate cottonwood bark, the inner bark of cottonwood trees. The soft cambium layer just beneath the rough outer bark provided enough nutrition to keep horses alive through months when no grazing was possible. The Comanche would strip cottonwood branches and feed the bark directly to their most important animals, the war horses and the best buffalo runners, while the rest of the herd pawed through snow for whatever dead grass they could find. This is one of the reasons the Comanche chose winter camps near cottonwood groves in river valleys. Not just for their own firewood and wind protection, but because the trees fed their horses. The camp location was not chosen for the people alone. It was chosen for the entire system, animals included. The Comanche also managed their herds with a sophistication that European observers often failed to recognize. As their population grew through the 1700s, they divided into increasingly smaller bands to avoid overgrazing. They moved camps frequently, they controlled the size of each rancheria, and they used their mobility to rotate through different river valleys and canyon systems so that no single area was stripped bare. This was not random wandering. It was range management, practiced across 250,000 square miles by people who had no word for ecology, but understood the concept completely. The horse also gave them something no other survival tool could: the ability to leave. If a winter camp was hit by conditions worse than expected, if a blizzard buried the canyon or a warm spell followed by a freeze created ice conditions that made hunting impossible, the Comanche could pack up and move in hours. They were not trapped the way a farming community or a settlement was trapped. Their entire civilization was portable, and that portability was their ultimate winter survival strategy. When the cold got bad, they went somewhere the cold was less bad. It sounds simple, but it required a level of geographic knowledge, logistical coordination, and physical capability that very few human societies have ever matched. And then, in the space of a few decades, all of it was taken apart. The destruction of the Comanche winter system was not accidental. It was deliberate, calculated, and devastatingly effective. The U.S. Army's strategy during the Red River War of 1874 was built on a single insight. You did not have to kill the Comanche to defeat them. You just had to destroy their ability to survive the winter. In the summer of 1874, Comanche, Kiowa, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors had left their reservations and gathered in Palo Duro Canyon to stockpile food and supplies for the coming winter. They set up camp on the canyon floor, exactly where generations of Comanche had wintered before. They had tipis, dried meat, hides, and massive horse herds. They were preparing to do what they had always done: survive. On the morning of September 28th, Colonel Mackenzie led 500 troopers of the 4th Cavalry down the narrow trails into the canyon. The attack was a surprise. Warriors fought back, and women, children, and elders fled on foot into the surrounding plains, abandoning lodges, supplies, and everything they had prepared. Mackenzie's soldiers burned over 200 tipis. They destroyed vast stores of dried meat and buffalo hides, the calories and insulation the bands needed to survive the coming months. Then they took the horses. More than 1,400 animals were driven about 20 miles from the canyon, and over 1,000 of them were shot. The slaughter was not random cruelty, it was the whole point. Without horses, the Comanche could not move their camps, could not hunt bison from horseback, could not reach fresh cottonwood groves, could not flee to better ground when the weather turned. They were pinned. The bands that escaped Palo Duro scattered across the staked plains without shelter, without stored food, and without horses, heading into the worst months of the year. Over the following months, group after group came into the reservations at Fort Sill in what is now western Oklahoma. By June of 1875, even Quanah Parker, the Quahati Comanche's most formidable war leader, surrendered. He later described the logic plainly. The women and children and elders could not survive without the system that had always protected them. The Comanche were not beaten by soldiers. They were beaten by the destruction of their cold weather infrastructure. Take away the tipis, the Pemmican, the horses, and the sheltered canyon camps, and even the most capable people on the continent could not outrun a plains winter on foot. And what replaced that system? For the Comanche, reservation life meant government-issued rations that arrived late or not at all, frame houses that were poorly built and poorly insulated compared to a buffalo hide teepee with a liner, and a diet stripped of the fat-dense foods that had fueled generations of winter survival. The knowledge did not disappear overnight. Elders carried it. Families practiced what they could within the constraints of reservation life. But within a generation, the integrated system, the one where shelter and food and mobility and geographic knowledge all worked together, was broken. And it was not only the Comanche who lost this knowledge. Modern civilization, the one you and I live in, has built an entirely different relationship with cold. We have central heating, insulated walls, electric blankets, grocery stores with year-round supply chains, and weather apps that tell us when to bring a coat. We treat cold as an inconvenience to be managed by thermostats, not as a force that demands respect, planning, and an entire system of preparation. That works fine when the grid is running. It fails completely when the grid goes down. Texas learned this in February of 2021, when a winter storm knocked out power for millions of people across the state. Pipes burst. Homes that had never been insulated for serious cold became unlivable. People froze to death in a state that sits inside what used to be Comancheria. Millions of residents had no backup heat source, no calorie-dense food stores designed for emergencies, no plan for where to go if their home became uninhabitable. The entire state's cold weather strategy boiled down to one word: electricity. When the electricity failed, the strategy failed with it. The irony would not have been lost on the people who once lived there. 1,000 years of accumulated knowledge about how to survive cold on the southern plains, and the civilization that replaced the Comanche could not keep the lights on for a week. The Comanche understood something fundamental that modern life has allowed us to forget. Cold is not an inconvenience. It is a force with its own logic, its own demands, and its own consequences for anyone who ignores them. They built a civilization around that understanding. They chose their campsites the way an architect chooses a building site, with wind, water, timber, and temperature in mind. They engineered their shelter to work with fire and airflow, not against them. They preserved food in a form so efficient that it sustained continental exploration. They managed their horses, their herds, and their movement patterns across a territory the size of a European nation, all to stay one step ahead of the season that killed the unprepared. And then it was taken from them, not by cold, but by the deliberate destruction of the system they had built to survive it. The last blockbuster closed and became a novelty. The last Comanche winter camp was burned, and an entire body of knowledge about how to live with cold started to fade from the human record. If there is a story that makes you rethink what survival actually means, it is probably the story of a people who watched the first frost roll across the staked plains each autumn and did not panic, did not flee, and did not depend on anyone else to keep them warm. They already knew what to do. They had known for generations, and we forgot. If you want to see how another civilization built an empire that collapsed from the inside, that video is on screen now.